Interrupted. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting. It's a really packed meeting, which is really exciting. It's going to be really good. My name's Debbie Jack. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in East London District. Tonight's meeting's on anarchism. It's an alternative to Leninism. It's part of the course on anti-capitalism and political organisation, and Pat Stack's going to be speaking on it tonight. Pat Stack, for people who don't know him, is a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and probably best known for his column Stack on the Back in the Socialist Review. He's going to be speaking for about 35-40 minutes, after which there's going to be plenty of time for discussion. Tonight, because it's so packed and because it's a really important meeting, we're using the speaker slip system. So if you want to speak, I'd really encourage you to get a slip from one of the team members, fill it in and pass it back. The reason why we're doing this is because we want to get the most out of this debate. We want a balanced debate, and I'd encourage people, if you have arguments or disagreements with the analysis given, that we really encourage you to put in a speaker slip, because we need to really have the discussion out. So without any further ado, I'll welcome Pat to the meeting.
Yes, thank you, comrades. I apologise in advance if I sound like I'm roaring at any stage, but I've had some eardrops and I can't hear a bloody thing out of one ear. So, I just want to start by saying, having been coming to Marxism for many years, I don't think I ever quite remember a meeting on anarchism as packed as this one, and I think there's a reason for that. I'd like to say it's because the most charismatic speaker ever is doing the meeting. But I have a deep felt belief that that's probably not the reason that the meeting's so large. And I don't think it's large because formally there's been a huge growth of anarchist organisations and so on. But there's no question that for very, very large numbers of people moving into conflict with the capitalist system, becoming part of the anti-capitalist movement, looking to the events of Seattle, looking forward to the events of Prague and so on, that there is a real debate and a question, and you can tell because some people already have indicated they want to speak and I haven't said hardly a word. There is a real debate and question about how change can come about. What's the nature of that change? What's the nature of the society we live in? The nature of the way in which society can be changed? The forces who can change it? And the type of organisations necessary for that change to come about. And I think those questions have come into sharp relief with the growth of the anti-capitalist movement, with the failures of reformism. If Tony Blair represents anything, he represents the ultimate bankruptcy of the reformist project, the fact that he's abandoned it himself. At the same time, the collapse of what we would have called the state capitalist or Stalinist regimes of Russia and Eastern Europe, and so on, and therefore whole numbers of new people coming onto the streets and looking for ideas. And it can often seem very attractive to believe, A, that you don't say that there's a specific class in society that's the agent for social change, but that actually there's a general discontent, and that's how change can come about. And secondly, to say you don't need organisation. There are new methods of organising. Funnily enough, I was involved in around about the time the British events taking place at the same time as Seattle, of doing radio interviews and so on, where the only thing that the radio interviewers seemed to want to discuss were violence on the one hand and the internet, which for some reason had absolutely fascinated them, that suddenly posters, mobilising, raising motions at union branches, talking to people, canvassing, he said that was all gone, it was now all going to be done on the internet. In addition to which, I think there is an attraction in the notion that everybody wants to change society. We want to do away with those forces that control our lives and that wreck our lives. And it can seem very attractive to say that in doing away with them, we'll do away with all forms of organisation, all forms of authority, all forms of coercion, and so on and so forth. The late Tony Cliff used to put it very well, I think, when he said, if you say to people, I'm in favour of the dictatorship of the proletariat, they think, dictatorship, that sounds bad, and who's this geezer proletariat who wants to who wants to be the dictator. And therefore, what I want to do in this meeting is to explain perhaps a little bit more what that actually means, but also to look at the key points of divergence between the revolutionary socialist, Leninist, Marxist approach to changing the world and that of anarchism. In doing that, I recognize there are many shades of anarchism, and I haven't possibly got the time to cover them all, and therefore I want to look at 2 or 3 of the historically key theoretical figures of anarchism, and I want to look at, in particular, 2 key events which test anarchism in practice. One, the Spanish Civil War, and the other, the one that I'm supposed to want to duck away from, and therefore I'm determined to take it on, which is the question of the Kronstadt uprising. Right. The first thing we have to say is that for us Marxists, we take a materialist view of the world. We share with people who look to anarchism the desire to tear the head off the bourgeoisie, the desire to transform society. But at the same time, we recognize that actually socialism, the project of human liberation, is possible now in ways that it wasn't possible 500, 600, 700 years ago. That capitalism itself for a period represented historical step forward, the destruction of feudalism, the opening up of the potential which we see all around us today. If you want it put in a nutshell, the difference between capitalism and feudalism is that if you talked about famine in the times of feudalism, you would talk about natural shortages, you would talk about problems of crop failure, problems of climate, of weather, and so on and so forth. Today, nobody needs starve. Capitalism has created the potential to feed the whole world many times over, but at the same time, because of the way in which capitalism is organized, it will never, ever achieve that goal. And therefore, we believe that the historic base of society, the real and material conditions, play a hugely important part in understanding how the world can be changed. The second thing that was crucial for Marx and for Lenin in turn was that the other thing that capitalism did was it produced a working class which was, Marx described it as capitalism producing its own gravedigger. Here was the class that created the wealth. Here was the class with the potential to liberate humanity. The strength of the working class was that it was the wealth creators, and the second strength of the working class is that unlike, say, the peasantry under feudalism, the only way forward for workers was through collective action. Collective action in the immediate to defend workers' interests, but collective action to transform the world collectively into a different sort of society. And therefore the strength of our class was collective and required collective measures. Flowing from that was also an understanding that within the working class there are very many different levels of consciousness, different levels of clarity about the world in which we live, about the desire to change it, about how that change can come about. And therefore the need to create a revolutionary party that understands the immense importance of the struggles at the point of production, but also recognises that the working class itself has to politically challenge capitalism, challenge it both on the political and the industrial front in terms of bringing about the end and the destruction of the system. The next thing that was absolutely crucial for Marxists was that capitalism holds on to its power. The capitalists hold on to their power. After all, they're a tiny minority in the world. They hold on to their power by a mixture of fraud and force, by a mixture of ideas which justify the existence of society, and by a state apparatus which is itself not neutral but is there in the interests of the ruling class to defend the interests of the ruling class. And therefore, it is absolutely necessary, and you cannot begin to think about transforming society without smashing the capitalist state. If you don't smash the capitalist state, then workers cannot take power. And in the process, it was argued that even though revolution takes place, it doesn't mean that classes simply disappear. The whole experience of the Russian Revolution and other revolutions was that the capitalist class fights tooth and nail uses every measure within its power to try and hold on to its position of privilege, its position of wealth within society, and therefore it is necessary, after the workers have made the revolution, to build their own state organisation to defend the interests of the working class. Now, I want to examine each of these key elements which seem to be absolutely central to an understanding of how the world can be changed against anarchist thought and against anarchist action. And to start with the question of materialism. Historically, what anarchism represented was a despisal, if that's a word, I think it is, of or something like that. It despised the capitalist system, but it tended to want to be a theory that looked backwards to better days that went before. It could see the horrors of capitalism but yearned for the old ways, or returns to the old ways. Marx described Proudhon, one of the founding theoreticians of anarchism, as the socialist of the small peasant or master craftsman. The desire to maintain the small peasant holdings, the small guilds of craftsmen, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that Proudhon himself, more and more throughout his life, regarded the capitalist state and the concentration of capital as the enemy, and the look back became more and more attractive. So it's fascinating that the man, if you ask anybody who knows anything, what was Proudhon famous for saying? He was famous for saying, all property is theft. More than anything else, that's what people... Actually, a lot of people think Marx said it. He didn't. But Proudhon argued towards the end of his life the exact opposite. He argued property is liberal, federalist, decentralizing, republican, egalitarian, progressive, a just bulwark against state tyranny and the concentration and the large concentration of capitalism. In other words, the thing which he'd identified as being at the root of all evil of society becomes something that's a bulwark for freedom, because you can associate property with what had gone before against what had come since. For Bakunin, one of the most famous founder, I suppose, of Russian anarchism, industrialization was a key enemy. Instead of recognizing again the progressive nature, not the horrors, Marx understood and Engels, you read their works, the horrors of industrialization, but they also understand that capitalism has unleashed potentials which weren't there before. For Bakunin, it's a complete rejection of that. He believes that if you like, the industrialized Western Europe has become decadent, and he saw the more primitive and less industrialized Slav regions as the regions of hope, as the beacon. Actually, he looked particularly to Russia as the beacon for where this change could come, whereas for most revolutionaries, Russia was identified as the prison house of nations, the fetter on the development of even bourgeois freedoms, and so on and so forth. For Kropotkin, who's the famous successor really to Bakunin, they actually coexisted for a period, again looked backward to small autonomous communities. He'd taken lessons from what he'd observed amongst Siberian peasant communes and watchmakers in the Swiss mountains, that small-scale production was the way forward. I mean, Avrich, the writer Paul Avrich, who actually himself is sympathetic to anarchism, is in the argument between anarchism and revolutionary Marxism, nevertheless identifies that what really Kropotkin looked for was medieval Europe with a few up-to-date trappings. And therefore, revolutions were not primarily about material conditions, and change was not about material reality. It was about will. It was about the propaganda of the deed, which Kropotkin in particular at one point in his life favoured. Individual terror, if you like, the acts of bomb throwing and so on. It was, I suppose, Che Guevara in a sense summed it up, although he thought of himself as a Marxist. If you're a revolutionary, make a revolution. In a sense, that the same thought lay behind much of the anarchist thought, and therefore, I want to touch on Kronstadt and the Spanish Civil War at different points rather than just take them as a separate part of this discussion. If you look at the Kronstadt uprising of 1921, for the anarchists it has become a rallying cry of all that was best about the Russian Revolution. It was a rising of the Kronstadt sailors at a particular point in time in the revolution against the revolution, supposedly in favour of a third stage of the revolution. You'd had the February Revolution and the October Revolution. February had got rid of the Tsar. October had brought the workers to power. The third stage was going to completely liberate the working class. But you can only argue such a thing if and as so long as you ignore the material reality of what was taking place in Russia at the time. Lenin argues about Kronstadt, and it's important to understand the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky and so on. You know, the old taunt, Trotsky's finest hour, will not do. It was not the attitude that Lenin and Trotsky took to Kronstadt. They understood that it was, if you like, a warning point of the difficulties the Russian Revolution was in, and therefore the breakdown of the alliance between the workers in the cities and the peasantry in the countryside. Lenin said it was a flash that lit up reality better than anything else. And Victor Serge, who was actually himself a Bolshevik, but by far the most critical of the Bolsheviks, of the Bolshevik action around Kronstadt, nevertheless said, the third revolution, it was called, by certain anarchists whose heads were stuffed with infantile delusions. Now, why does he say that? If you look at the Russian Revolution, the fantastic gains of October, the land to the peasants, peace, pulling out of the First World War, the introduction of huge reforms around divorce and abortion, literacy, the right of self-determination to the various republics and so on and so forth. That was the fantastic plus. That was the shining beacon. On the other hand, precisely because the revolution was doing those things, there was a civil war waged by the White Russians trying to restore Tsarism. There were 16 armies of intervention going in to smash the revolution on the side, essentially, of the Tsarists. And there was a trade embargo in order to try and break the Russian economy. And the truth is, if you look by 1919, and the situation is considerably worse by 1921, Russia, the revolutionary regime now has cut off the following raw materials which it had at the time of the revolution. Turkestan raw cotton, cut off from the Bolshevik regime. Baltics flax, cut off. Baku Caucasus and the Caucasus oil, cut off. Ukraine coal and iron, cut off because those areas were occupied or divided by the white soldiers. Only 10% of the fuel existed in Russia as it existed in 1917. 15,000 versts of railway track existed in Russia. I don't actually know what the measurement of a verst is. If anybody does, they feel free to tell me. But compare it to 70,000 versts, which is what had existed in 1917, and you know there has been a huge destruction of the rail system. 60% of the trains were out of order. There was a fall in production of iron ore to 1.6% of the 1914 level, and of cast iron to 2.4% of the 1914 level. The cities were starving. The more and more the Bolsheviks had to order crop requisitioning from the countryside. He said sometimes we took everything the peasants had and more. You know, he admitted that this was the problem. The threat of the White Army and so on. Once the threat of the White Army seemed to recede and the Civil War drew to an end, you could begin to see that the peasants who up to that point would rather die with the Bolsheviks, whatever their criticisms, than surrender to the Tsarists, now began to break with the Bolsheviks, to have separate interests from the workers in the city and so on and so forth. These were explosions of anger. They represented something real. But if you think everything I've just described, and then you say there could have been a third revolution, well, how? How could there be a third revolution? How could the revolution move forward in the material circumstances I've described? And if it couldn't move forward, who would gain? And I want to come back to that question later. The next question I want to deal with is the question of the role of the working class, the gravedigger. For Karl Marx, it was absolutely essential that you couldn't understand how human liberation could come about without understanding the development of the working class. This was the class that was going to change society, and as he put it, in the process, change itself. Bakunin, in denouncing this, argued that his socialism was purely instinctive, which was sort of true and therefore at times terrifyingly awful, but nevertheless he argued that really the skilled artisans and the organised factory workers were tainted by pretensions and aspirations. In other words, the most advanced workers were bought off. They were out of the equation, and therefore, as he says himself, you have to look to the lumpens, the peasants, the outlaws, the uncivilized, the disinherited, the illiterate. Actually, all the people that Victor Serge in his book goes on to show precisely proved to be key enemies of the revolution at every key point, the most vulnerable to being brought back by the other side and so on and so forth. For Bakunin, these were the key people. For Marx, for Lenin, the revolution was the festival of the oppressed. It was workers throwing off their chains. It was the removal of oppression throughout society. And it was throwing off the muck of ages. The humans were growing in the process of revolution. For Bakunin, completely the opposite. The revolution represented infuriated mobs driven by instinctive passion for revenge. Now, you know, in those that wasn't something he was condemning. He actually advocated infuriated mobs with instinctive passions for revenge. Infuriated mobs with instinctive passions for revenge can destroy a lot, but actually in creating a new order, it cannot begin to play the same role. For Kropotkin, he saw that, unlike Marx, who argued that all history was the history of class struggle, that to understand society you had to understand the conflict between the classes. This was the key way in which society had moved forward and so on. Kropotkin saw cooperation and not conflict at the root of the historical process. He argued that mutual aid was the natural order. He studied animals closely and made some very interesting, you know, in as much as people drive you mad by telling you that we're all basically bad because they've watched a program about tigers eating each other or something, or lions eating zebras. He tried to show that there was much cooperation amongst animals and so on, which there is, although there is also much destruction. But nevertheless, he argued that this was the natural order, was cooperation, and it had been broken not by the development of class society, but by the development of centralized states, and therefore Average, again, who, as I say, and I deliberately use people like Average and Serge, because if anything, they're the most sympathetic. Average says, he looked around him and saw roads and bridges were free to all, streets paved and lighted for everyone's use, water supplied to every house, parks, museums, libraries and schools open to all. In every case, said Kropotkin, such arrangements are founded on the principle of need, so that when you go to a public library, for instance, the librarian does not ask you what services you have rendered. And therefore, he believed society was developing in these things towards this natural order of cooperation and so on. And it therefore followed that if the natural order was cooperation and not class conflict, then the working class was not key to the change, and the class struggle was not key. And from then, all sorts of methods. Once you reject the working class as a central agent of change, all sorts of methods involving all sorts of sections of society become the solution, from the riot to the bomb. Famously, Marx, who described anarchists as liberals with bombs in their hand, that they would hurl bombs, actually, but really didn't have an understanding of the way in which society was organised. Kropotkin, as I say, was himself in favour of the propaganda of the deed for a period, and I suppose there was an anarchist group in Russia which summed it up beautifully because they were called Motiveless Terror, which summed up their strategy for trying to bring about change. And therefore, if we come back to the question just briefly of the Kronstadt uprising, part of the argument that has always taken place between revolutionary socialists and anarchists is, look, Petrograd lost 57% of the working class. They're gone. They were either killed at the front or had fled back to the countryside because they had nothing to eat. Moscow lost 44.5% of the working class. The composition of the Kronstadt sailors have completely changed. Why does this matter? It matters because if the working class is being destroyed, then the democratic driving force of the revolution is being destroyed with it. And this is the real and fantastic material problem that the revolutionaries face. It tells us an enormous amount. It told the anarchists very little. And therefore, if class is not the key, then how you organise is not class-driven either. And therefore, anarchism rejects the notion of the revolutionary party from two directions. First of all, the most obvious one, which is democratic centralism. I think it's worth just saying here, what is democratic centralism? Democratic centralism is the organisation of like-minded socialists within a party who discuss and argue, who go through democratic processes, not because it sounds nice, or it's a nice pill to lessen the bitter taste of centralism and so on, but because you cannot begin to move forward unless you can draw on the experiences of those involved in the struggle, unless you can contrast the relative experiences. Sometimes, we know in our own party, sometimes the experience of the cadre is crucial to carrying the party forward. Other times you'll hear members of the Central Committee saying the best members are the ones who've been a member for a week, because they bring fresh experiences, fresh enthusiasm, and so on and so forth. But democracy is central. It's essential. The centralism ensures that you have a party that acts on the will of the majority decision once the discussion has taken place, and organises centrally against a centralised state machine which would crush the working class. For anarchists, it was undemocratic, represented the seeds of dictatorship, stifles the individual, and so on and so forth. But the problem that faces anarchism always is, if you're serious, and I mean now if you're not just someone who calls himself an anarchist and sits at home and says, I'm an anarchist, and they feel very, very radical. But if you're serious about changing ideas, and I think a lot of people moving towards who might be looking to anarchist ideas now are very serious, the question of organisation becomes fantastically important. You can't ignore it. You might like to think the Bolsheviks did it all wrong, but what do you put in its place? And here, what was the alternative in Russia put forward by Bakunin to the forms of organisation that the revolutionary Marxists chose? Bakunin put forward an incredible, labyrinthal type of leadership structure. The organisation had two overlapping forms, one secret, involving only the intimates, and one public, the Alliance of Social Democracy. Even its open public mode, the Alliance, was to be a highly centralised organisation with all decisions on the national level approved by the Central Committee, since it was the real controlling body. The secret organisation was even more tightly centralised than the public organisation, with first a Central Committee and then a Central Geneva section, acting as the permanent delegation of the permanent Central Committee. And finally, within the Central Geneva section, a Central Bureau, which was to be both the executive power, composed of 3 or 5 or even 7 members of the secret organisation, and the executive directory of the public organisation. Now, I think if you joined that organisation, you'd never quite ever know who was leading what. But you can, and it wasn't that he merely saw this as a means of organisation of his organisation. He actually saw it as a means of organising the revolution itself. Secret bodies working within secret, far, far more undemocratic and far, far more dictatorial than anything that the revolutionary Marxists had put forward. And therefore, to an extent, it was how the FAI operated in Spain, to be honest, within the CNT, as a sort of semi-secret organisation within, and so on and so forth. The other response from anarchism, and I think by far the more serious response, and the one that deserves taken seriously, was the response of anarcho-syndicalism. The idea, a sort of mixture. It was said they took the ideas of how society operated from Marx, the freedom and looseness of the anarchists, and trade unionism for the struggle at the point of production. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies in the United States, the CNT, and George Sorel, the CNT in Spain and George Sorel's CGT in France, all operated on these lines. They understood, in a way that Bakunin and Kropotkin people didn't, the power of the working class. They understood the need for collective action. They understood the centrality of the point of production, but, crucially, they rejected political struggle. They believed that all you had to do was fight at the industrial... It wasn't that they weren't political. They were highly political people. If you read any of the works of most of the leading members of the CNT or the IWW and so on, fantastically committed, fantastically political and committed on all sorts of levels, but they didn't see that political struggle in and of itself was part of the process, and therefore looked merely to struggling at the workplace. And they believed that that's where the power of the capitalists would be broken. Big Bill Hayward of the IWW said that with syndicalism you would end up with less a seizure of power and more a ceding of power. In other words, once you control the factories, power would follow. The power of the capitalists would be removed. And here lies a crucial question of how the capitalists hold power. And the first of all on this is the question of fraud. You know, every day they sell us all sorts of ideas about how this is the natural order of things, how this is the way things should be, that they've always been rich and poor and so on and so forth. You need to have bosses, you need to have leaders. They sell us all sorts of other ideas, that we have enemies that we don't have based on the colour of skin or gender or sexuality and so on. That's the fraud of their system. And then in between, they have another fraud, which is the people saying we can change the world as merely by getting elected within the existing system without challenging that power and so on. And therefore, for revolutionary Marxist theory, the building of a party that has a theoretical understanding of society, that has the memory of all the struggles that have gone before, that has events like Marxism 2000, to be honest, where we discuss all these things, not because, oh, hey, you know, what else have we got to do in a week in July, so let's do it, but because actually all these questions that we discuss are of central importance, contrasted sharply a party that would draw those lessons from, say, again, Bakunin. He said, by teaching the workers theories, Marx would only succeed in stifling the revolutionary fervour that humans already possess. The impulse to liberty, the passion for equality, the holy instinct for revolt. Scientific socialism, he said, had no place. His own socialism, as I said, was purely instinctive. Now, the problem with that is that when workers move onto the stage to actually challenge power, you have to believe that you can win, you have to know how you won in the past, how you were defeated, and so on and so forth. You have to understand how the system operates and why. The reason that we take the stands we do consistently on different wars and so on isn't because, hey, we're just sort of good pacifists, but because we understand the role of imperialism and so on and so forth. More seriously comes the question of force, the question of class power. And here, this proved to be an absolutely crucial question when the anarchists were presented in practice with the struggle to change society in the Spanish Civil War, the fantastic revolts in Catalonia, the workers' militia, the taking over of the factories and so on and so forth. Here was the fantastic opportunity. And at one stage, the Prime Minister of the region, Campagnas, surrenders power. He says to the anarchists, take it. I mean, what can I do? You know, that you may as well take it. The workers look to you and so on and so forth. And Olivier, one of the leaders, Olivier, I think it is actually, one of the leaders of the, actually he was a leading member of the Five, the militant anarchist organisation operating within the CNT, he said, our dilemma was clearly a choice between libertarian communism, which meant anarchist dictatorship, and democracy, which meant collaboration. And because all power was bad, including anarchist dictatorship, in reality, he chose collaboration. And of course, the choice was between building a workers' government to act in Catalonia as a focal point for the defeat of Franco and the creation of the social revolution, or collaborate, leave the capitalist system intact, and pave the way for Franco's victory. Faced with that possibility, they chose collaboration and failed to take on, to smash the state and take power. And in choosing the latter, they were continuing to refuse to see any difference between a workers' state and a capitalist state. There was no difference. One was a dictatorship, the other one at least was formally a democracy, and therefore will choose the capitalist state. And the logic of that, of course, meant that 4 ministers ended up joining the Popular Front government in Catalonia. They made appeals against street fighting. They stood by, they had some complaints, but in reality stood by as the POUM, the revolutionary left organisation, was persecuted. They were expelled from the government and promptly returned, having gained nothing in the negotiations, and formally recognised the state. So at the end of it all, having rejected a workers' state, they end up accepting the capitalist state, allowing the replacement of the militias and so on and so forth, and therefore crushing the way, paving the way for the crushing of the revolution. And it's interesting that one group of anarchists stood out against this, the Friends of Durruti, an organisation which had become increasingly critical of what the organisation were doing. And Felix Morrow, who wrote his book, who was a witness to the event, says, of special significance were the Friends of Durruti. Why? Not just because they were critical, but because they represented a conscious break with the anti-statism of traditional anarchism. They explicitly declared the need for democratic organs of power, juntas or Soviets, in the overthrow of capitalism, and the necessary state measures of repression against the counter-revolution. In other words, if the revolution was to survive, that was the only way that it could. And this failure, the failure in these circumstances to do that was crucial. Again, in Russia, come the 1917 revolution, many of the best and most militant anarchists found themselves fighting alongside the Bolsheviks, whilst others rejected the Soviets, rejected workers' power, and so on and so forth. And in State and Revolution, Lenin spells out that you have to smash the capitalist state, and in its place to defend the revolution, institute a worker state, different from the capitalist state, in that it represents the interests of the vast majority against the interests of a minority attempting to seize back power, wealth and privilege, as opposed to the capitalist state which represents that minority. And that finally, with the withering away of classes, which wouldn't just disappear because you'd had a revolution, but with the withering away of classes, so the state itself would wither away. And these were the real these are the real choices that revolutionaries faced. And that's why, when it came to the Kronstadt uprising, the workers' opposition, which had been critical of the Bolsheviks over questions of internal democracy and so on, stood absolutely by the regime against the Kronstadt rising. Victor Serge, who, as I said, is very critical of a number of things the Bolsheviks did, nevertheless put it clearly, if the Bolshevik dictatorship fell, it was only a short step to chaos, and through chaos to a peasant rising. The massacre of the communists, the return of the emigres, and in the end, through the sheer force of events, another dictatorship, this time anti-working class. In other words, it wasn't going to be the sailors or the anarchists who would benefit in these circumstances. It was going to be the old order. And here, again and again, there are representatives of the old order celebrating. Milyukov. I'm not sure whether this is a shift to the right or the left, but we'll support the slogan "Soviets without Bolsheviks," which was a key slogan of the Kronstadt uprising, a slogan which could only play into the hands of the old regime of the right, and so on and so forth. Again, Vershin, a member of the Kronstadt Revolutionary Committee. Enough of your hurrahs and join with us to beat them. Beat the Jews. It's their cursed domination that we, the workers and the peasants, have to endure. And so the muck of ages begins to reappear in a revolt that's held up as a shining beacon for freedom and so on. In these circumstances, you saw the re-emergence of anarchist groups. There was a group called Hurricane Death. Death to civilization. Take up your axes and destroy everything in sight. The Bolshevik dictatorship is the worst tyranny in history. Actually, the Bolshevik Revolution was the first real hope of the 20th century that really we could live in a different sort of world, one that wasn't determined by profit and so on. The fact that the revolution was crushed by its isolation should in no way give ground to people who objectively ended up arguing for the return of reaction within Russia. And therefore what I want to argue is that in both theory and practice, anarchism ultimately fails the test of providing for human liberation. That rests with the working class. That rests with the need to smash capitalism. That rests with the need to create worker states. That rests with the need for workers' organisations and for revolutionary parties single-mindedly committed to building a new order and single-mindedly understanding how that new order can be built.
Thanks very much, Pat. Now I'm going to open up the meeting for discussion and debate. We've got quite a lot of slips in. What I'm going to do is call people and call the person after them so that person can get ready. So we have as much time as possible for people to speak. You'll have 3 minutes. You don't have to speak for the whole 3 minutes, but I'm going to be really sharp on people speaking over the 3 minutes. After 2 minutes is over, I'll tap the mic, and that means you've got a minute to go. The first speaker is going to be Richard Stevens, followed by Martin Empson. And if you can come down to the microphone here.
I think we've got to be clear that anarchy isn't from the Greek, it may be from a Greek word, which goes back to a long time ago when the Greeks were writing dictionaries, etc. But it's a 19th century ideology. We've got to be clear with that. It's really old. And I am willing to work with any anarchist, but I find it difficult to do so when some of them burn our socialist worker papers as they did on May Day. I find that infuriating. And it's also, I find the anarchist, a lot of them quite even more infuriating when they sort of edit history. I've mentioned no anarchists argue with me at the moment about the Bakunists at work in Spain in 1894, a pamphlet which Engels, rightly so, criticised them for. None of them came out about that. Instead of liberation, they set down a more repressive regime and basically making life more difficult. And I think it's got to be clear, it is the petty bourgeois politics of despair, and Trotsky was right, that they are the masters of counter-revolution and the harbingers of fascism. And the people they celebrate are people like Mankno and Kronstadt, or at best, anyone who kills Bolsheviks. So, and I think they even come up with an even more fundamental difficult problem, this anti-authoritarian argument they come up. A revolution is an authoritarian measure. It's when one class imposes its will upon another class. That is an authoritarian step. Be it the bourgeoisie trampling over the feudal lords, be it the working class trampling over the bourgeoisie. It's an authoritarian measure. One class oppresses another. And we've got to be clear with that. But our revolution is there to liberate mankind by sweeping away the bourgeoisie. Now, if anarchists can't recognise that, and as Pat Stagg has clearly stated, they haven't, where are they going to go? They keep picking up these credentials, they keep raising these arguments, but at the moment, I've never seen any successful anarchistic uprising.
Martin Empson will be followed by Dragan Plavsic.
So I want to talk a bit about the anti-capitalist mood that's out there, because I think there is a bit of a myth, actually, that the anti-capitalist mood is an anarchist mood, and I think it's something that is partly comes from the way that the media portrays demonstrations like May Day, demonstrations like the J18 events, and so on. For instance, 3 weeks ago in the London Evening Standard, there was a newspaper article talking about people who were going to Prague to demonstrate against the IMF, where it's their headline was "Anarchists adopt football hooligan tactics to get to Prague." If you read the article, actually what they meant was that we were booking coaches and selling tickets. Actually, we haven't booked any coaches yet either. But within that, I think that there is a sense of anarchist politics. So individuals on those demonstrations, at those meetings, involved in going to Prague, do label themselves anarchists without having a real understanding of anarchist history and so on. And anarchist groups, as an organised groups, make up a tiny minority of that of that milieu. And if you indeed, when socialists intervene in those actions or go on those demonstrations or go to those meetings, actually you find that you're not met head on with a wall of anarchist propaganda. You're not met head on with a group of people who refuse to talk to you, refuse to work with you, or refuse to, or indeed set fire to your newspapers. Because actually, that was a tiny part of that demonstration, and actually I think was completely unrepresentative of the events that were going on in May Day. I'll give a few examples of this very quickly. Firstly, on the guerrilla gardening demonstration. If the guerrilla gardening demonstration was made up of tens of thousands of anarchists who were rejecting hierarchical organisation, who were rejecting political slogans, who were rejecting political parties, why were there so many Ken Livingstone badges on it? That's actually what we have to look to, that layer of people. When we went to the Anarchist May Day conference that took place 2 days before the Reclaim the Streets thing, actually the London Socialist Alliance Loud Halo van went past that. demonstration, actually transform the political mood inside those meetings and so on. Actually, when our comrades talked about why we were voting for Livingston, why we were standing candidates in the Socialist Alliance, actually we got a real hearing. Those weren't there was not an automatic rejection of us. It's no surprise that people label themselves anarchists. You know, we live in a hierarchical world. We live in a nasty world. We live in a party political world where there's no democracy, where politics is the Tory or the Labour Party. It's no wonder that people use the language of anarchism to describe themselves. Actually, we celebrate that. We want more of that. We want people to reject that world. We want people to reject that sort of party politics. But actually, within that milieu, within those people who want to go to Prague to take the head off the IMF and the rest of it, we do have to fight for socialist politics. We have to fight for the centrality of the working class, because the real danger is if we don't fight for real socialist politics, other politics can grow with inside that anti-capitalist mood, some of which can be anarchism, some of which can be the people who want to go back to primitive communism or whatever. Actually, we have a political view which is that the working class is central to change, that's central to that idea, and central to a successful revolution will be a centralised revolutionary party. We have to fight for that within the anti-capitalist milieu.
Before the next speaker, I'd like to ask a question. Why do anarchists want static demonstrations instead of a moving demonstration? Are they frightened of pulling a working class people together as a revolution does? And after this speaker...
Positive one can take from the anarchist tradition, and it seems to me that one of the things that one can take from it is anarchists thinking about the role of the state. Because anarchism has traditionally had a very sceptical attitude towards the state. And it strikes me that that issue really reaches a point of significance in the context of the Russian Revolution, where effectively quite early on what one saw was a very considerable concentration of economic and political power in the state. It's in that context that, for example, one leading Italian anarchist, Enrico Malatesta, wrote in quite early on, in July 1919, he said about the Bolshevik regime at the time, he said, in reality, one is dealing with a dictatorship of a party, and a very real dictatorship with its decrees, penal sanctions, executions, and above all its armed force that today helps defend the revolution from external enemies, but tomorrow will help impose the dictator's will on the workers, stop the revolution, consolidate and defend new interests of a new privileged class against the masses. And he added, Lenin, Trotsky and comrades are certainly sincere revolutionaries, and they will not betray what they take as revolution, but they are preparing the governmental apparatus which will help those who follow them to profit by the revolution and destroy it. They will be the first victims of their methods, and with them I fear the revolution will collapse. And I think he therefore the question therefore arises from that is the role of and the function of the state in this revolutionary situation, and whether there are other ways of dealing with the situation. And that statist thinking, I think, comes through in other ways. Trotsky, for example, in his Revolution Betrayed, clearly still thinks that state ownership of the means of production is in some sense a working class gain. I think that is a question that needs to be asked about that particular element in Trotsky's thinking. Equally, I think Trotsky did not break with the idea of the one-party state, certainly didn't whilst he was in Russia, and did so only quite late on in the 1930s. So I think that's an element of anarchist thinking which fruitfully can be taken into the international socialist tendencies tradition to reflect on some of its own traditions.
Sam Ashman will be followed by John the Hat.
I think Pat said that anarchist ideas are growing, if not anarchist organisation, and I think that's true. I think they're because superficially, anarchist ideas can be very attractive. You know, I think the idea that you direct action, you take to the streets, you don't muck about in Parliament. The idea who needs the state, that sort of thing. It sounds radical, it sounds revolutionary, but actually I think it's only revolutionary and radical in a very superficial way. And I think that if you're talking about, I mean, Martin's quite right about the broad anti-capitalist milieu being, much broader than anarchists. But if you talk to people influenced by anarchist ideas or who see themselves in some way as an anarchist, then I think their attitudes about the working class are very revealing about the degree of radicalism. Because actually, I think far too many see the working class as a brainwashed cog. A small sort of, narrow-minded, completely conned by the system, and into accepting all the rotten ideas of society. And the thing is, and then you get the idea that you kind of drop out, you just kind of hang around with a clique, and you do nothing to try to address or fight for the ideas that are inside, to change the inside the working class. It's the idea that people are boring, they've got mortgages, and so on, they're well to the system. Now, that's quite common, but then, actually, people are very serious, though. People are confused. So people that are influenced by that may think, there's a bit of that around. But, I know a guy he's influenced by those ideas, but he does actually hate the world. He really, really hates capitalism. And so when you argue with him about the working class, he can begin to see that maybe there's that power there that could do something about capitalism. So I say, okay, so right, now you're convinced about the working class, and he goes to anarchist meetings, so what are you going to argue when you go to those meetings? And, and he accepts, there's people there that, accept the brainwashed cog sort of theory of the world. And he says, okay, right, I'm going to argue about those ideas. I'm going to try and challenge them. And I said, well, come on then, what are you doing there? You're actually in some ways, you're acting as a vanguard, because you're saying, right, my ideas are right, and I'm going to try and tackle the ideas that are out there. I'm going to try and challenge them. And I think that's the kind of arguments we need to have. Because I think we have to say that our politics are actually more seriously radical than anarchism. When you think about it, we don't just, think people doing paper sales, at factories. Why is that? Well, it's because we want to take revolutionary politics into the working class, and we want to win those people. We don't accept the idea that people are all tied to the system. We want to actually win people to use their power. And we actually believe, if anyone in the room's got any doubt that we don't believe this is true, actually, let me make it absolutely clear. We believe that one day the British working class will use its power to smash the existing state, and create a dictatorship of the proletariat. And there's a difference about the dictatorship of the proletariat, because dictatorship. The thing about the proletariat is it's a majority in society.
So, John the Hat's going to be followed by Andy Durgan. Before that, we've got another question. Is socialism a viable step to an anarchist society?
All right. I wrote on the slip for application to speak where it says organisation. I wrote none. This is because I'm an anarchist. This does not mean that anarchists are not organised. There was plenty of organisation on June the 18th, but I dare say a lot of you missed out on that one. It seems quite strange. It seemed quite strange to be on a major demo without someone trying to sell me a copy of Socialist Worker. Still, I found something much cheaper for the next few days to wrap my spud peelings in. It's a pity you couldn't have had an anarchist here to tell you about anarchism for more than a few minutes. I'm sure I would have great difficulty in replying to much of Pat Stack's analysis, because when I find myself reading about such history, and knowing that if I were to find something by someone from the other innumerable warring factions of the left, each slagging off the other's analysis, I'd find myself sliding into a very shitty, boring quagmire. Not that understanding history is boring. The perpetual backbiting and nitpicking from socialists against other well-meaning, committed activists is. And I don't say it doesn't happen amongst anarchists, of course, but, it's what I've come to expect, though, from certain sessions like this, anyway. Right? So let me just finish by telling you of what the superior attraction of anarchism is. I think when you realise that you have the embryo of it already within you, you'd find it to be a superior attraction. Thing is that I really didn't have time to knock this thing together, so I've had to just chop out huge chunks of this, and I've just got to kind of stick with the basic thing, I suppose, about like the only person who can represent me is me. For someone to represent the ideas of someone else that's close to them, a friend, a partner, it's not always possible because no two people believe exactly the same. But when, of course, you have somebody trying to represent hundreds, if you're going to kind of replace the system we've got where people continue to represent thousands, tens of thousands, it's not really done. You shouldn't really require that of any individual. And I just refuse to delegate that responsibility of representing my ideas to anybody else. It's not for an MP or, a vicar or some kind of god even, or somebody who would set themselves up as a god, right, to take that job off me.
Before Andy speaks, there's another question. What was the position of the anarchists during 1917, and what was the reaction of the Bolsheviks? And Andy will be followed by Chris Banbury.
Yeah, I think, just to make a general point, why this meeting is so important, it has been said by other comrades, I don't want to reinforce it, isn't actually that we have a massive debate with people who call themselves anarchists. I think the key thing about all this is that you find, especially in the anti-capitalist movement, a lot of people with what are anarchist ideas and they don't actually call themselves anarchists. I think that's the crucial thing about this, actually, rather than discussing finer points with people who define themselves anarchists. In relation to the last speaker, I wanted to make some comments about the CNT in Spain, because it's, of course, when we talk about anarchism, when we talk about socialism and Marxism, there are lots of different tendencies. I mean, the last comrade who spoke obviously represents the extreme form of individualism. I mean, it doesn't actually represent, for example, the major anarchist organisations which other people have referred to, particularly the CNT, huge collective organisations, certainly delegated things to others. They had workers' delegates, they had leadership. In fact, the FI, as Pat had mentioned, operated in quite a dictatorial manner inside the CNT. But if we look at the practicalities of revolution, obviously it's not enough just to say no one can represent me. And obviously the question is not being whether or not being represented by someone, it's how you're represented by someone. Whether you actually have a representative you can recall, whether you have a representative which you can control. And criticising anarchism isn't just about being negative, about backbiting and so on. It's actually about clarifying ideas. And also, I think we've made it clear, and I think we should, if it's not clear, it should be made clear, that obviously amongst the anarchists, historically, there have been millions of, thousands of fighters who we would stand shoulder to shoulder together in any struggle. This can be seen with... I think probably the most important example is the CNT. I mean, the CNT organised hundreds of thousands of workers. It was an incredible organisation at one level, without any bureaucracy or full-timers to speak of. Incredible examples of working-class solidarity, especially the syndicalist wing of the union, able to organise the most impressive strikes without strike funds and so on, to bring the whole of Barcelona in particular to standstill at various periods in the early part of the 20th century. But also there's a major problem, because faced in the Spanish Revolution with the dilemma of seizing power, what did the CNT do? This massive organisation, the most important organisation, anarchist organisation in the history of the 20th century, totally collapsed. And it isn't just that the leaders betrayed, which is often what anarchists say. The actual rank and file, the vast majority of them, initially accepted they had no choice but to collaborate. They'd made their revolution, they'd taken the factories, taken the land, they'd armed themselves. Now what? This was the problem. They didn't trade commerce, they needed a unified military structure to fight the fascists. They recognised this, but as they weren't prepared to seize power, they made it very clear their only alternative was to collaborate with the existing state structure. And what happened, of course, was what we all know, was that the revolution itself was down in blood, and thousands of anarchists themselves were imprisoned. In the end of 1937, there were 15,000 anti-fascist prisoners in the Republicans' jails and in the work camps. At the same time, the leadership of the CNTs continued to collaborate with the Republican government. This is the tragedy of anarchism, and this isn't some sort of sectarian harping. It's actually to learn from that, the fantastic experience of these people, and reclaim it for us, because I think they're part of the revolutionary tradition, but at the same time be clear that it had all sorts of major weaknesses which we cannot afford to allow to be repeated when our chance comes to make the revolution.
Chris Banbury will be followed by Mike Gonzalez.
Yeah, there were three blokes standing on the leaf outside. I'm afraid I don't think they came in. If they did, I'd be quite happy if they made themselves known. I don't think they came in. And I kind of thought, well, they've got a leaflet, they're putting special into this meeting. Aren't they confident about what they've got to say? And then actually the woman next to me had a copy of the leaflet, and I was reading it while Pat was speaking. No, it's nothing to do with you, Pat, sorry. And it suddenly says, looking over the shoulder, it says, the Socialist Workers' Party, just if you stop laughing for a minute, because it angered me, this. The Socialist Workers' Party opposed mass non-payment of the poll tax in England. And I thought, hold on a minute, Becky Palmer, in Hackney, spent weeks in jail, single parent, 2 mothers, for not paying the poll tax. Phil Ramsell went to jail, an oil comer in Manchester, for not paying the poll tax. I never paid a penny of the fucking poll tax. I organised a poll tax union in my estate. We took Peel for Trafalgar Square. Windsor German's still been done for £1,500 of the poll tax. These pillocks come along, say a blatant lie, and walk off into the night because they'd rather go for a pint. You know, that is not a serious debate. But having got that off my chest, I then want to turn around and say, what does working class democracy look like? And this isn't an abstract question. If after this meeting you want to see working class democracy, let's go up to Islington. Let's go up to NDO where 1,000 postal workers are out on an official strike. And let us then ask, what is the method of working class democracy behind this? The thing is decided by a mass meeting of all workers democratically, a decision is made, and then absolutely rightly it is being enforced by picket lines, which have shut down every other office in that Islington, and if it comes to it, if Scabs want to break that picket line, I am in favour of using authoritarian means in this instance to impose it, because actually it's in the interest of the working class to stop it. The decision's going to be spread, I hope, by flying pickets. That might imply a bit of authoritarianism, I do not know. But actually, this is working class organisation. It's happening every day around the world. It's not some abstract concept we have. It fits where people are at. If you went up to that decision, strike and says, OK, we took a decision to come out and strike, but as an individual, I'm not going to come out and strike, and people say, oh, that's all right then. That is not how working class people think. And I'll tell you why NDO we've got to support and make sure they win. They're out to break NDO because it's the most militant post office in London, in this country. Why is it? Because they're actually rank and file people who give leadership. And by leadership, I don't mean like Tony Blair, who say things like, we shouldn't cross picket lines, there's a picket line outside this office, who give solidarity, who support fight against racism, who raise issues saying, as postal workers, we should support black people in the receiving end of violence. That's what leadership is. It's not about what Tony Blair stands for, it's about ordinary rank and file workers, ordinary rank and file people, trying to explain a world that's gone mad and saying what we should do about. And I tell you what, leadership happens every day. Someone at Trafalgar Square in 1990 gave leadership when they turned and actually led in the police. Someone in a riot gives leadership. Someone in a strike gives leadership. Nameless people. Not the Blairs, not like that. But there is leadership, and people follow behind it. And actually, leadership isn't a dirty word for us. It's a reality of the day-to-day struggle. And working class democracy is a reality of the day-to-day struggle. And we want to build in that working class democracy. We want to generalize from it. And we want to make an alternative to this rotten, undemocratic system.
Mike Gonzalez will be followed by Nikolai
I've got to follow
Genchev.
that. I think I'll be anarchic about it. I think, you know, there are a number of things to be said. I think that partly, you know, we talk about, Pat's done a brilliant survey of the history of the anarchist movement, but I think we agree that the anti-capitalist movement is full of anarchist ideas in one form or another. And I just want to try and identify just a couple of those. I think in the first place, you know, many of the comrades, who have come to these ideas new or received some part of them, there are certain central themes. The first central theme is we are, you know, a kind of fear of the collective. I think one of the things we have to remind people is that we, in this organization, in the SWP, stand in a tradition which has made absolutely clear the difference between those regimes and those movements which, describing themselves as socialists, repeatedly repressed and removed from workers their power to act and to organize. That is not socialism. That is not the collective power that we're talking about. And if the young people who are coming to the anti-capitalist movement are afraid of that, then we say we stand side by side with you, because we are terrified that anybody should confuse that with what we understand to be workers' democracy and workers' power. That's the first thing. The second is that The comrade mentioned it. I prefer to represent myself. Well, actually, we're not talking about about anybody representing anybody. See, socialism is that moment in which the class, the collective, the majority become the agencies of their own liberation. It's not a choice between one representative or another, one delegate or another. It's a way with all delegates. Let us be the architects of our own destiny. Now, if that sounds, something fearful, something terrifying, as it were, the collective overwhelming the individual, then we should be very clear in our own minds that individual rights, the right to be an individual, is a right that is very, very limited in the world that we live in. You can be your own self, but your own self is caged and constrained and limited and policed by a million different institutions. Let's try and imagine what happens to individuals when the collective, the majority of society, actually do exercise power. Is this some kind of tyranny? Of course not. It looks like the Commune. It looks like the Soviets. It looks like the Cordones in Chile. It is the moment when the most unimagined creative possibilities sometimes suddenly become realities. It is when individual workers are at their freest because they are protected and guaranteed by the collective of which they were a part. And that's crucial that we say that over and over again to the comrades who are influenced by anarchist ideas in this new movement. And finally, the Zapatistas in Mexico have become almost a kind of utopia for many of those comrades, I think, and on the basis in which they're often the kinds of defenders you'd rather not have. People have said, you see, the good thing about the Zapatistas as an example of the, if you like, of the ideal, the utopian commune to which we look, is that it is an organization, a collective, which renounces the battle for power. Well, comrades, I take no pleasure in this, but the reality is that at the point at which you renounce the battle and the struggle for power and the right to power which is implicit in the way you have struggled, the ruling class then prepares itself to seize what you have gained. Today, the Zapatistas, magnificent fighters as they are bounded and besieged by an army of 60,000. That commune which renounced power and therefore, as it were, removed the hope of the seizure of power from all those that looked to the Zapatistas as a kind of example. That was not a virtue, comrades, it was a weakness. It was a weakness because it announced to the capitalist class that they were not under threat, and now, as so many times before, they will take their terrible revenge. Those are the lessons that we should bring home in our debates with the comrades in the anti-capitalist movement.
Nikolai will be followed by Arlene Finnegan.
Yes, I'd like to come back to the contribution from Dragan, who talked about Malatesta and the problem of too much statism in the Russian Revolution. And I think you often hear it said that Lenin, in the course of the revolution, Lenin wrote this fantastic book, State and Revolution, which talks about how socialism is about the abolition of the state, that the state is an indication that society is irrevocably divided into classes. Lenin stops writing this book, the revolution starts, and then really Lenin must have been lying because the experience of the revolution is something completely different. And I think that's a mistaken understanding. I think the problem, if you look at this in terms of aspirations, in terms of ideals, it can seem appealing. If you look at the question of dictatorship of the proletariat in terms of the realities of defending a workers' revolution, and I think it becomes much more clear. It was precisely because I think to understand it, you have to see that the dictatorship of the proletariat is something that is a transitional stage. It's something that is a necessary means of defending the Russian Revolution against the counter-revolution. And you saw that necessity very, very early on, even before the revolution actually was successful. You saw it in the Kornilov coup. Before the October Revolution, you saw it in the uprisings by the white generals that started immediately. You saw it in Finland, where the Finnish Bolsheviks were butchered at the beginning of 1918. People say, 1917 October was a coup because, where was the mass street battles? Actually, when we talk about dictatorship of the proletariat, we're not simply saying this is about violence. It's about winning as big a section of the working class as possible to fighting for a different kind of society. The reason there was relatively little violence in October of 1917 was because there was nobody left to defend the old order. You had the provisional government sitting in the Winter Palace, and detachment after detachment that's been sent to defend him peels away and fails to fight. But actually, faced with a real reaction after the revolution, what was the choice? There's two examples, I think, two serious examples of working class movements taking power in history: the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution. Now, the Paris Commune is, ended is much easier to hold up as a heroic. They didn't set up a checker. They didn't, have the period of war communism and so on. The tragedy is the Paris Commune lasted for 70-odd days. It ended with the murder of 30,000 communards in Paris. The Russian Revolution held on for longer than that. Yes, it was isolated in the end. Yes, it was ultimately defeated. But that was a failure not of statism inside of Russia, but of lack of Bolshevism outside of Russia.
Arlene will be followed by Josep Gargante, who will be the last speaker of this session.
I just wanted to speak about the effect of some anarchist ideas on the anti-capitalist moods in popular culture at the moment, because obviously since Seattle it's really trendy to be an anti-capitalist, which obviously is fantastic, but you do see some pretty bizarre effects where there's no clear set of ideas about how we do take on capitalism, how we do organise people. For me, the best example of it is Primal Scream, who 10 years ago was saying if everybody goes out and takes acid, then their lives will be wonderful, which is a half-truth. But but now they've become really political. They support the Satpal Ram campaign. They spoke out against the war in the Balkans. They've spoken out against NATO, which is great. But the last single was called "Kill All Hippies." Now, I really hope that this doesn't mean that had they been on the Seattle demo, then they would have been bludgeoning all the Turtle kids. But, I think it does show the need for an organisation that provides people with ideas, that, does organise people, that, gives ideas to people about how the system works and how we take it on. Because, if we just go around saying, ideology sucks, let's just smash the state, then A, how do you take on that state when you don't understand where power lies and how it works and recognise who the main enemies are? And B, what's the point in smashing the state if you don't replace it with anything? Much as I can represent myself, I do not have the time or the skills to go out and manufacture all the resources I need to live my day-to-day life. And, I think if we are to make the most of the anti-capitalist mood at the moment, we do need to, recruit young people who do hate the system to an organisation that can organise them, that can, get them to read Marx, read Lenin, read Trotsky, and understand how the system works, how they can take it on, so that when they do express the hatred of the system, hopefully by taking up arms and trying to smash it, they're not going out and using those arms against hippies, but they're using them to take power by force from the bosses.
Some months ago, I was in a demonstration in Barcelona, a demonstration of 8,000 students fighting against privatization. I was selling the paper, and I listened in my bag, "You are a reformist." I said, "What's this?" I said, "Well, was a member of CNT," and I said, "Why you told me that I am a reformist?" And say, "It's very easy, because you asked for both United Left." I said, "Well, true, this is the true, but why we ask for both United Left? Because there is a great difference between a student who vote for the Tory party and a student who vote for United Left, who want to change something, who want to fight against privatization." I say, "What do you think about the United Left and Socialist Party?" And the answer was, Socialist Party and United Left are worse than the Tories, because they say they are They say they are left, but they are liars. I say, well, you have a real problem, because you are surrounded of 8,000 students who vote Socialist Party and United Left Party, And if they say, if you think they are your enemy, you can relate with them. And after this, I start to solve some more papers.
Before I call Pat back to sum up this evening, I'd like to invite Mark Dolan up from the NDO dispute to talk to us.
united will never be defeated. The workers united will never be defeated. The workers united will never be defeated. The workers united.
Thanks a lot, comrades. I only wish that I could take all of you up to the picket line now, and you know, you can give us another rendition of that. But I've got to say, it wasn't my intention to speak. And after Chris spoke, I did say to someone, what's the point of me getting up now? But I think it is important to talk about working class organisation, because I've just left the picket line that I've been on since 5 o'clock this morning. Black, white, men, women, standing on that picket line, not saying, when are we going back, but when are we getting other officers out with us? That's what they're saying. As most people probably know, we've been out on strike now for 3 days. And let me make it quite clear, because it's really important. Because we've had the press down again today, and we've gave them comments, and they're still lying. This is not about the dispute last week. This is about Royal Mail attacking all of our terms and conditions that we've won over many, many years. Our office is probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest office in the country, with some of the best agreements. And our union have agreed a way forward, which is certainly not a way forward, it's certainly a way backwards as far as we're concerned, that they're trying to ram through our office, which will attack and undermine and get rid of all the terms and conditions that we've won over for many years. And basically, Royal Mail's attitude is, you are coming back on your knees. Well, I can tell you now, there is no way that I or any of my people on that picket line are coming back on their knees. Because I tell you now, at this very moment, John Keggy, our National Union leader, and our divisional reps are trying to sell us out. Let's make it quite clear about that. They are trying to sell us out. That is the nature of the bureaucracy. They are trying to sell us out. And what we've got now is a situation where this morning, and you talk about working class organisation, because this morning we managed to get the following offices out on strike in support of us. Northwest 2, Northwest 3, these are postal districts. Northwest 4, Northwest 5, Northwest 6, Northwest 7, Northwest 8, Northwest 9, Northwest 10, Northwest 11. And that's only for starters. All right? These are offices within our branch. But today, well, as I said at the start, what our members are really asking is, when are the other offices going to come out in support of us? And let me make it quite clear that we've got a mass meeting in the morning at 6 o'clock. We've got people there, I'll tell you, we've got one bloke there. Do you know how long he's worked for the post office? A half an hour. He's worked there half an hour. And people said to him, welcome to the NDO, get used to it. And obviously he was worried, but he's worried about his job, but we've made it quite clear to him. We don't go back to work until everyone comes back and no one is disciplined as a result of that industrial action, whatever it may be. I'd just like to finish by saying that, as I say, there's a mass meeting at NDO tomorrow morning, and it'll be mostly the staff that I represent in the N1 Postal District and the North West 1 Postal District, probably the two most militant sections in that office. And what we will be arguing, and I'm sure most of the people and people that I represent will be arguing, is we don't stay on that picket line tomorrow. We get in our cars and we drive down to EDO, we drive down to Mount Pleasant, and we get them out with us.
Excellent. Just before Pat sums up, if you bear with me, I've just got a couple of announcements. TV Choice are presenting their video Nazis in Margate, Are Refugees the Real Problem, tomorrow at 2 p.m. in SOAS. There's a caucus for all MSF members tomorrow at 6:15 in SOAS. And tonight's entertainment includes the film Blue Collar at 8:45 in the Video Theatre. And instead of just another Elvis band, we have the real thing, Calling Elvis, Hawaiian shirts and all. Whatever that means. Sum up, call in Pat to sum up.
Yes, I want to use the mic. It's all right. Yes, I rather two things on that. Listening to Mike, I'm absolutely delighted. I bought a ticket to go to Ireland today. I live in NW5. And for some reason, absolutely best known to myself, I arranged to pick it up from the travel agent. So I'm a very relieved man, I think. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And I think, when you hear that, that's exactly why we're all here. That's what the struggle is and what the struggle's about. The second thing I want to say is, having explained that I couldn't really hear anything before I started, my ear strangely popped in the middle of Chris Bambury. It then sort of started ringing violently. And only with the soothing tones of Mike Gonzalez did it really begin to function properly again. And there you have the perfect blend that makes a revolutionary party. I want to start, first of all, with the person. I want to, as quickly as possible, get through this. The person who talked about backbiting. Actually, I suspect there are a few people in the audience who are a bit disappointed that I didn't do considerably more backbiting and lots of horror stories and why Kropotkin stood on World War I and what an anti-Semite French nationalist Proudhon was. But I'm not going to do any of that. I want to come on to the second point that he made. I wanted to try and show what the central tenets of revolutionary socialism and Leninism are, and how anarchism fails to provide adequate answers to them. I want to talk just briefly about the second thing he said, which was nobody represents me, the only person I represent is me. And I think there's two things about that. Number one, if we know anything about capitalism, is that if all you represent is me, then actually the things that determine how you behave in society are not to do with you. They're to do with the economic constraints, the legal constraints, and so on of the system in which we live. And the problem is that you cannot then fight and destroy that system on the basis of lots of me's. You fight and destroy that system precisely on the basis of collectivity, cooperation, interaction, and so on and so forth. And that's what the whole history of our class is about. That's why Mike Dolan didn't go to the boss and say, hey, how's about giving me a special deal, me? All I represent is me, instead of which he represents an entire section of workers whose only way of achieving what they want to achieve is to fight collectively. And that, I think, is the absolute centrality. We don't go on demonstrations as lots of me's. We go on demonstrations as one us, fighting to change the world. The third thing I wanted to do is take on Dragon, to take on some of the points that Dragon made, because they were serious. The first thing I do have to say is that, realising his audience, I think, Dragon was a little bit, how can I put this? He made Malatesta rather kinder to Lenin than is actually the facts. This is Malatesta on the death of Lenin. Even with the best intentions, he was a tyrant who strangled the Russian Revolution. And we who could not admire him while alive cannot mourn him now he's dead. Lenin is dead, long live liberty. That was the rather keener view of Malatesta on Lenin than the one Dragon has tried. And it seems to me that the problem, that when Dragon said that there are interesting questions raised by Malatesta on the question of the state, fine. Where are the interesting answers? And this, it seems to me, is the profound problem. How do you get rid of the existing society without smashing the state? How do workers hold power without building their own state? Those answers are answers that anarchists have never ever been able to come up with properly, and therefore, come the crunch, they've either collapsed into cooperating with the existing state, as in Spain, or somebody asked about Russia. The Russian anarchists essentially split three ways between a hostile section to the Bolsheviks, a sort of neutral section, but many of the best ones enthusiastically joined the revolutionary struggle, joined the government actually, were put in Soviet positions, played leading roles in the Civil War, because rather like the Friends of Durruti, when it came to the question of how could you change society, then actually you had to look back to what the Marxists said. And here, I think it's important that we understand something else. I mean, I know, you know, that Dragan doesn't fall in the camp of right-wingers who merely want to say that Lenin led to Stalin. Nevertheless, there's a seed of that in what he's saying, and I think you have to say, look, the truth of the matter is, why isolate this one question? For the Bolsheviks, if you read John Reed's account of 10 Days That Shook the World, you are reading democracy as the world has never seen it. You are reading participation as the world has never seen it. You're reading change as the world has never seen it. You're reading involvement as the world has never seen it. You're reading the destruction of privilege, that wonderful point where Trotsky's not allowed into a meeting, and I nearly said something very arrogant there, that Trotsky was not allowed into a meeting. I wasn't allowed into one the other night, and then it occurred to me, hey, hang on, that's no comparison. That Trotsky was not allowed into a meeting because he didn't have the right badge, and so on. The right card. No one can imagine anyone challenging Stalin and saying, I'm sorry, comrade, you don't have the right card 10 years later. No one can imagine that there's anything in common between the liberation of the view of liberating women within society that the Bolshevik Revolution took up, and awarding medals for breeding that the Stalinists introduced. No one can imagine that there's any similarity between granting the nationalities their freedom, as the Bolsheviks introduced, and the destruction of national rights and actually the whole movement of population by the Stalinists. No one can believe for a minute that the destructions of the democratic organs have anything to do with the democratic organs themselves. And no one can believe for a minute that the key which Trotsky and Lenin understood, whatever intermediate positions they had to take, they understood that in order for the revolution to succeed, it had to spread beyond the boundaries of Russia. Stalin introduces the concept of socialism in one country. Stalin represented the negation of everything that the Bolsheviks and the revolution stood for. He represented the isolation and strangulation of the revolution. Trotsky described him as the gravedigger of the revolution. There is no continuous thread. And we come back to the question, and it's a very sharp one. You see, Lenin himself recognized during Kronstadt, he said, the problem is, they do not want the White Guards, and they do not want our government, but there is no other. There is no other. And therefore, what is the choice? How does Malatesta, how does Bakunin, how does Kropotkin, how do any anarchist thinkers answer this question? The choice is in reality between those desperately holding on to a decaying workers' state in the hopes that the revolution will spread, and those paving the way for the most fantastic reaction, which probably would have given fascism a Russian word instead of an Italian one. That's the reality, the hard reality that faced an isolated revolution. And was Trotsky wrong on the question of property determining the nature of the regime? Yes, he was. But if that's all you see, then actually you don't see much, because despite that, he maintains the living, breathing ideal of revolutionary socialism. The emancipation of the working class being the act of the working class itself. The need for the revolution to spread, and so on and so forth. He kept alive a revolutionary theory that was being butchered and bastardized by the Stalinist regime and by the apologists for that regime. And really, the problem is that for the anarchists, it seems to me, is this. You have no answers. There are no answers to these questions. And at the same time, you provide the Stalinists with the cover of respectability of somehow suggesting that what they did and what they had something to do with the Russian Revolution, and had something to do with socialism, and had something to do with changing the world. They were the gravediggers. And I think the final point we have to say is that their destruction is one that we in the SWP, the destruction of those regimes, we didn't share the view of many on the left that this was a defeat for the left. We absolutely understood that these regimes were dictatorial, that these regimes had no workers' control, had no vestige of socialism, represented the antithesis. And therefore the people that were bringing them down wanted to tear the heads off the leaders of their society. And in Ceausescu's case, they more or less virtually did tear the head off the leader. You know, somebody said at the beginning, it's very hard to work with the anarchists. To be honest, working with anarchist groups who seem to give out the sort of leaflet that sent Chris into orbit, and quite rightly, is not the question. The question is, how do we address all those people who want to tear the heads off the bourgeoisie, not just in Britain but internationally, who want a different world with different priorities, to do away with starvation, to do away with inequality, to do away with unemployment, to do away with war? How do you do it? And I believe that the debate, and the very serious debate with the anarchists, isn't that we don't agree that we want to do it, but that we have the means and the tools and the understanding of how it can be done, and they don't. And therefore, if you want to tear the head off the bourgeoisie and you want to change the world, come and join us in the Socialist Workers' Party and fight for that change in the future.
About the picket lines and where people can go to join it. I think there are a lot of mumbles who joined it.
When I actually said what I said is that thing about representing me.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing is, this thing about people who go on strike and they go on incapable of
that's good. That's good. No, I'm glad. The really, really mad ones.
But what you said about me,
black guy, that one. Yeah, what one? I went for shopping today, and suddenly there's a motorbike by crashed by a white car, which is the white car was drove by that black guy, and he was scared of getting killed by the police. So we would like to ask if anything can help him, that something happened by the police to have the message.
I understand why he was involved in a car crash. Yeah, but he was.
You're going over tomorrow, are you cross? No. What?
Version of Skype.
I just have to say no.